The title that I have been given to share with you about in these 15 minutes is Challenging the Existence of God Through Challenging the Prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I'd like to feed off of what our beloved Sheikh Mukhtar elaborated so beautifully and kind of summarize it, because I need that to feed off of and to actually discuss with you a few things that I have in mind on this topic. Essentially, in my personal experiences, this is not something based on books and research. It is based entirely on anecdotal, personal experience. My own journey towards faith and friends and others that I've met along the way that have had conversations with me about trouble in believing in God and things like that. Basically, atheism boils down to two issues where people of faith and people not of faith see things very differently, as far as I'm concerned. And I think one of them was almost completely dealt with in Sheikh Mukhtar's talk, and that is the idea of how we view creation. The idea that a believer sees creation very differently. We're looking at the same sun, the same moon, the same earth, the same existence, the creation of our own selves, down to the same protein, but the conclusions we're reaching are very, very different.
And I would agree so far in that the conclusions reached by the theist are completely disconnected from all available evidence. That's not to say that every atheist who looks at the evidence must hold to the correct view on every topic, as that is not the case, but merely that every theist who looks at that evidence and claims God has to assert without basis that God is somehow involved. Just because there are two general positions on a single question involving the origins of the universe and life within it as either naturalistic or magical, does not then mean that both positions or interpretations, as you refer to them, are equally valid. Nor does it allow for the nuance over the fact that just because an atheist acknowledges there's insufficient evidence, scientifically or philosophically, to assume God's existence, that they have a grasp of either science or philosophy on every other topic in discussion. Likewise, it doesn't allow for the hypothetical nuance in that even if there were sufficient evidence for God, that would not necessarily make it the God of whichever person you asked. The thing is, that's all rather irrelevant, since no valid evidence for God exists whatsoever. And so we come to my first video in response to Nouman Ali Khan, following my previous one on Zakir Naik. It will certainly be interesting to see what Nouman has to bring forward in defense of his God. But I doubt it will be much in the way of new or unheard of. But there's only one way to find out.
For an atheist, it is essentially chalked up to chance and order and chaos, and has no purpose or conscience in and of itself. The entire universe is without conscience, and therefore it is easy to extrapolate from that human beings themselves don't possess a conscience. So the entire idea of right and wrong and morality, all of it can be washed away because it is entirely up to us to decide what is right and wrong, etc. Right?
No, you are in fact very wrong. There is nothing, I repeat, nothing about the theist's incapability to supply evidence in support of their God, which follows on to assert universal formation is purely chance, and that morality may as well be scattered to the wind. There's a very large chasm between the position of atheism and what you have just declared that swallows any apologist so bold to try and jump said chasm. No, an argument should be like a bridge which crosses said chasm safely. The fact is, science doesn't know the specifics of universal formation well enough to declare chance as the winner, something which is important to keep in mind considering that necessity is also a possibility. All an atheist would say on universal formation is that currently there is insufficient evidence to support thus far untestable divine magic over a multitude of testable naturalistic explanations such as quantum instability or multiverse. And as for morality, human beings have a conscience which can be observed. So simply asserting that a conscience can't possibly arise out of a non-conscience is a claim in need of support. I value human well-being. That acts as a basis for my morality. And there's nothing about divine pixie dust sprinkled by a god which necessarily improves one's morality. Thus, all you have done here is strawman all atheists as a feeble attempt to hold theism as somehow superior, which helps nobody in the long run.
So a consequence of believing in this chaos is actually it brings the chaos to human existence. In other words, we're not answerable to anyone, and we don't have to have any order in our lives, right? So there are consequences to this beyond just an academic exercise about the origins of the universe. They have direct impact on how we see our own lives. Okay.
No, not okay, as is a complete lie. If it weren't, could you then perhaps explain to me why more secular nations with lower religiosity, such as Sweden, are far superior to every Islamic and Christian-dominated nation on Earth? About the worst thing about Sweden is how Russian and American neo-Nazi blogs are circulating alternative facts about the state of the country due to the refugee crisis to try and promote religious violence, which really isn't Sweden's or atheism's fault.
So that's fun. Just the first thing, how we view creation. And the second most common discussion, and there are obviously branches that come out of these discussions, but the second major one is essentially the matter of attributes of God. And if there is a God, how is he so unfair? And this thing boils down to, and I'm being, again, very unacademic as I explain this to you, it's either a personal matter or it's an observational matter. So in a personal sense, it's, if God is so awesome, how come I was diagnosed with cancer? How come I lost my job? What did my child ever deserve to die? How come the tornado hit my house, not the next door house? Basically, matters of justice, God and his relationship with justice, right? How come this injustice happened to me? So it's some kind of a personal trauma, which was alluded to in the previous talk as psychological origins of atheism, right? There's a personal experience with some kind of bad experience, and you blame God for it. How come he didn't protect me from it? How come he didn't come to my aid? I even prayed to him so many times and I still failed, and I didn't get into medical school, etc., and therefore I'm having a crisis of faith. That's on a personal side.
Yes, it is personal, but it's also philosophical and therefore intellectual. Atheists do not blame God. Theists on their way to becoming atheist do. What an atheist realizes, however, is that you cannot have a God defined as all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving or just in a universe like ours. A God with these qualities would know of evil, be able to stop evil, and would want to do so. And yet, that's not what we observe, either on a personal level, like you have just described, or in the big picture, as you're about to go on to. Therefore, either the God as defined by you or the universe has to go, and since the universe doesn't seem to be going anywhere, it's your proposed deity that's got to go. Ultimately, what you're attempting to do here is play down a person's questions over the personal suffering they have faced as simply an emotional reaction, and therefore lacking any reasonable basis, which is really a dick move.
On the observational side is how come there is war? How come there's disease? How come there are diseases that have no cure yet or whatever? Or how come there are catastrophes where innocent people are dying? And all of this, look around you, where do you see justice? How can you believe in a God that lets all of these kinds of things happen? So on the one hand is how we view creation, how we observe the universe around us and obviously even ourselves. And on the other hand is matters of justice. Is matters of justice, whether they have to do with personal experience or it has to do with one's observations of the world. And that's basically, of all the conversations I may have had with people that are having trouble with faith, or just don't see it, or see people that believe as some kind of primitive pre-modern creature that doesn't belong in this century, when they have these conversations, it boils down to one of these two things. Essentially, it boils down to one of these two things.
Well, I'm here to tell you that the reason I don't believe is the fact that to date, not a single apologist or a single theist in the countless hundreds, if not thousands, I have talked to throughout my life has ever been able to bring forward a single piece of evidence that has stood the scrutiny I have given. It has nothing to do with the differences in interpretation or philosophical paradoxes that only destroy the gods of Abraham and a few others. No, the first and only issue I need to take with you is your inability to supply evidence in support of your claim that God exists, and until you understand that, you will always be doomed to fail when it comes to talking to atheists. We don't want you talking about interpretations which don't exist. We don't want you to try and portray our position as one based in knee-jerk reaction. We want you to supply evidence for your claim that God exists, or simply keep quiet.
Now, my subject is not where atheism comes from, but rather one of the superficial criticisms of people of faith is actually not a conversation about God or about the validity of an existence of God or a God or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with perfect attributes, but rather a conversation about how silly it is to believe this thing people call revelation. How can you people believe that there's a man who God speaks to and gives a message to, and this message is supposed to be absolutely followed, and this man had no scientific, exploits, and he was living in pre-modern times in the middle of a desert, or even those before him, the other prophets that came before him, and they're supposed to have a message that's relevant to all of us, even though we're living in the age where discovery and information is now more evolved and more expanded than ever before in human history. How is he supposed to know better how we live our life? And he lived in a primitive desert where they didn't even have brick construction. How is he supposed to tell us how to live our lives? You see, this is the kind of underlying premise of the questioning of revelation.
Well, I have never heard it put that way before. What I have heard, however, is that people question your God's apparent wisdom in seemingly spending all their mana coming out to a man prior both modern archiving and broadcasting methods. This is a problem for you, the believer, on two different levels involving your God as opposed to the apparent prophet themselves. First of all, it points out the fact that Allah went from apparently performing miracles to convince people of their existence to having no measurable impact on the universe whatsoever, questioning either their desire, their power, or their existence. Second, it points out the seeming impatience of a God at picking the worst possible time conceivable to carry out said miracles, questioning their knowledge, their self-control, or once again, their existence. But you just keep on stuffing straw into those trousers, because that's all you're making here. One big straw man.
The argument I'm trying to present to you is if someone's already having a problem with the ultimate authority, Allah Azza wa Jal, then having a problem with his ambassador to the earth and having a problem with his message sent to the earth and his messengers is only a secondary issue. That's only a secondary. And even if you resolve this issue, the underlying issue is a denial of Allah Himself. That doesn't go away. So a lot of times, young Muslim people, and I've seen this in my own experience when I was younger and a lot dumber, and I'm still climbing out of the well of stupidity myself, but
your own words, not mine.
I see a lot of young people still caught up in this thing, and they're really fired up about their da'wah and things like that. And an atheist comes, or a Daniel Pipes comes, or some of the other writers come, and they say, look, the Qur'an has contradictions, or it has this or that or the other, or you people believe this. The Prophet Muhammad says this They don't call him prophet. They don't say sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We do, right? And he says, this is found in Bukhari and this is found in Muslim. How do you explain this and how do you explain that? And we get so fired up and we need to answer all of those criticisms. And we feel the urge to say, no, there's no contradiction here. There's nothing here. You're actually looking at it the wrong way. And they label all of our responses as apologetics. Okay, all of our responses are basically us finding one way or the other to rationalize what is inherently flawed. That's how they view it. The problem with all of this is we're getting caught up in a game that is designed for us to lose. It's by design. The nature of this game is no matter what you come up with, لا يؤمنون. And it's not لا يؤمنون بالرسالة. It's not a matter of rejecting revelation. It's a matter of rejecting Allah Himself. Allah Himself.
No, there is no game designed for you to lose unless you think reality is just a game. What I mean by this is the very fact that you can't supply valid evidence in support of the existence of any God, let alone your God. That is why you lose. Reality has a bias against theism because we observe no evidence in support of a deity. The conversation is no more rigged against you than it is for those who believe in dragons, unicorns, and jinn.
Now let's turn to the Qur'an for some guidelines on this, on atheism. I would consider myself finally maybe a beginner student of Qur'an now after maybe 15 years of trying to understand this book. And I can tell you one thing with some level of confidence. Atheism is not a subject in the Qur'an. Atheism is not a subject in the Qur'an. Qur'an does discuss doubt. It absolutely does. It does discuss doubt. But it discusses doubt in revelation. It discusses doubt in messengers. It discusses doubt in the afterlife. All the things, all the aspects of our faith that stem from believing in Allah. The conclusions you're supposed to reach, if you truly do believe in God, there are some conclusions you're supposed to reach on your own, like this God would not have left me without guidance. This God cannot be unjust, there must be some mechanism of justice. All those conclusions people doubt and those are discussed. And when it comes to Allah and doubt, Allah just asks the rhetorical question as though it's not even a valid concern. Afillahi shak? Is there even doubt in Allah? And even that's not, it's not even afi wujudillahi shak. It's not even, is it in the existence of God there is doubt? But rather, afillahi shak can even be understood as, are you doubting His justice, His mercy, His love, His care, His guidance in what He's telling you? Are you doubting any attribute of His? Not His existence. His existence is not questioned in the Qur'an. And the answer to that Shaykh Mukhtar referred to from Surah Al-A'raf just hands it to us because it's a natural, part of our being. It was instilled inside of us, the belief in Allah. We have to work to exercise it out of our system. That's our view.
And that's a view which is scientifically shot to pieces. Theism, specifically the belief in Allah, is in no way intrinsic. That is why your religion wasn't around until the early 7th century. Therefore, all you are doing is adding to the burning pile of rubble, which was any hope of your religion at being taken seriously the moment you invoked the fitra. Now there's a watered-down rung to this argument which argues that all belief in God or gods was simply the heart's attempt to return to Allah whilst cut off from the message and messenger. But that raises two problems. One, how does an all-powerful God fail to get a message global? And two, how do you account for the Piraha tribe in the Amazon, which doesn't have any word for God or even the basic principle? The bias of reality strikes again.
Our view of ourselves and our view of the universe around us is fundamentally different. It's fundamentally different.
And the view of myself compared to you is fundamentally different. Does that mean one of us is not human? You see, you're relying on a highly subjective, wishy-washy statement that can be used to argue pretty much anything you want it to. This is why we prefer objective evidence you can't simply feel away.
Finally, I want to talk to you about the miracle of the Qur'an and the miracles given to previous prophets. And these conversations have been in our tradition for a very long time, and you've heard some version of this either in a halaqah or in a khutbah or at Sunday school before you passed out. But somehow or another, you've been exposed to the idea that the Qur'an is a miracle. What I'd like to share with you in how much time do I have before I get the parking light? What's the time? I'll just keep going? Okay. All right, I'm not going to keep going. I'd rather hear from you guys. But what I want to share with you is, when it comes to the miracle of the Qur'an, what's usually done is that it is the idea of the Qur'an being divine, right? Here's proof that it cannot be the product of the human mind. Here's conclusive evidence. It is usually presented from one dimension or another. Perhaps it's the scientific knowledge it contained. Perhaps it's linguistic perfection. Perhaps it's legal depth. You know, how comprehensively it covers issues like inheritance in such brief language. Perhaps it's brevity in speech. Perhaps it's its imagery. Perhaps it's its power on human beings, its psychological effects. Perhaps it's the impact it had on human history. What other document has had that kind of impact on human history? Perhaps it's its readership or the effects it has on a person individually. Perhaps it's its spiritual power. There are all of these different dimensions of what makes the Qur'an miraculous.
All of which are either completely irrelevant, overstated, or outright lies. The Qur'an is one of the least scientific books there is, right up there with the Bible and the Lord of the Rings. I mean, salt and fresh water don't mix because apparently Allah created some invisible barrier that keeps them apart. Hello, we have a term for that mixing zone. It's called brackish water, aka the point where water from a river mixes with that from the sea. It's got its own plant life and fauna, for crying out loud. Not to mention the sun apparently setting in a muddy pool on this earth. And don't even get me started on beef resurrection. As for popularity and impact, that only demonstrates that it's easily utilized by dictators trying to control people. Does Mein Kampf or the Communist Manifesto become divine as well? Also, isn't the Bible ahead of you in numbers of print and numbers of followers? So your argument doesn't work there either. In all, this entire string of assertions is just one big mess.
The problem, however, is when we phrase it incorrectly. When you phrase it incorrectly, you're saying the Qur'an is a miracle because of these reasons. That, in my humble opinion, is phrasing it incorrectly. The Qur'an is miraculous in more ways than you and I can understand, or perhaps even appreciate in a lifetime. But what I find, I'm phrasing it the way I think it should be phrased. What I find particularly miraculous about the Qur'an is, and then you fill it in. What I am left dumbfounded with is this. What captures me more than anything else is this. You see, the miracle of the Qur'an experienced by Umar bin al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, when he was listening to the ayat as a disbeliever, hiding behind the veil of the Kaaba, and listening to the ayat being recited by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that could pretty much even read his mind. He was thinking something in his mind, the Prophet doesn't know he's there, he's just reciting the words. He said, this is a pretty beautiful recitation, this is some good poetry. وَمَا هُوَ بِقَوْلِ شَاعِرِ, here's not the word of a poet. And he didn't say it out loud, but the Qur'an is being recited saying it's not the word of a poet. He goes, I read my mind. وَلَا بِقَوْلِ كَاهِنٍ, it's not the word of a mind reader. Whoa, read that too. تَنْزِيلٌ مِّن رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. If you were to ask him at that moment, what is the miracle of the Qur'an? He'd say these ayat. These are the miracle of the Qur'an. In other words, the miraculous power of the Qur'an is appreciated at an individual level. It is appreciated at an individual level. It is not one dimension or the other that is blasted across humanity and everybody will believe it or appreciate its power in the same way. It doesn't work that way.
Actually, have you seen what happens to non-believers in Islamic nations? But returning to non-Islamic nations, this is not a new method. Protestants have been peddling this ever since they broke away from the Catholic Church, and ever since atheists have been able to speak without risk of execution, we've been pointing out the flaws in personal revelation. The biggest one is coincidence, which is beautifully highlighted in the example you just gave. If billions hear said text, then some will be thinking of something similar to what is then mentioned shortly afterward. It's pure math. The same happens with people in books all the time, not to mention movies, TV, games, and of course, conversations. Have you never gone, I was thinking the exact same thing that person just said? I recently had a similar instance involving the very first episode of Game of Thrones, Season 7, with my partner. During the 5-minute recap, we were both talking about Arya Stark and how we hoped she would carry out her revenge on the rest of the Freys, at which point we paused to clarify only the men since the Freys were purely male-led and thus the Red Wedding was not the women's fault, at which point I thought about Arya using Walder Frey's face to lure all the sons to the twins to murder them at once. The fact that this was the very first scene did not mean that the producers of the show were divine, as great as they are. It simply meant coincidences happen, and so I like my evidence a little more standardized and repeatable.
And the evidence of that I want to present to you from the Quranic perspective, and I'll sit down. You see, belief in Allah is a composite of two things to us. It's a spiritual reality and an intellectual reality, yes? The belief in Allah Azza wa Jal is on the one hand a spiritual truth. It is something that rests in the heart of the believer. But at the same time, it is something that we call to ala basira, with eyes open. There are fundamental, philosophical, rational, commonsensical evidences based on which we believe in Allah Azza wa Jal, some of which very eloquently and very comprehensively you heard in the last talk. Okay. The same is true of the Qur'an. Reflection on the Qur'an and a complaint by Allah Azza wa Jal that reflection is not happening as it should, tadabbur is not happening as it should, is iterated a couple of times in the Qur'an. And once it is mentioned as a spiritual problem, and the other time it is mentioned as an intellectual problem. It's incredible. أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Allah complains about the lack of reflection on the Qur'an and questions whether is it the hearts that have their own locks placed on them. That's a long discussion. I'm not going to explain the ayah or discuss things from the ayah. But what I'm going to get to is, Allah argues in the ayah, He complains that people don't reflect on the Qur'an enough because there's a problem where? In the hearts. Yes? In the hearts. Another place in Qur'an, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. How come they don't have reflection on the Qur'an? And had it been from other than Allah, they would have found a lot of contradiction in it. Now, when you're looking for contradictions in a text, is that a spiritual exercise or an intellectual exercise? That's an intellectual exercise. The reflection on the Qur'an, on the one hand, Allah claims it doesn't happen because people, their hearts aren't in it. Their hearts are not in it. But if their heart was in it and they were seriously looking into the Qur'an and reflecting, then they would discover that it absolutely has no criticism, no contradiction. The question about people who say, I've read the Qur'an and it's got a lot of contradictions. Okay, I've read your Qur'an. I live in Texas now, I can't help it. I read the Qur'an, it's got a lot of contradictions. You read it, but you haven't what? Reflected. You haven't reflected. And when you reflect, you will only discover that there is no contradiction. But who is going to spend time reflecting on the Qur'an? Except someone who is deeply, genuinely, from their heart looking for guidance. Otherwise, you'll do a casual read, pick out the things you'd like to criticize and move on. Qur'an makes its miraculous nature clear to the one who gives it a fair chance. If you give it a fair chance, it'll make itself clear to you.
Wow. The class of bullshit being levelled here is one of such toxicity that it erodes any chance for intellectual honesty you may have once had. The word reflection has been hijacked by the Islamic apologist and warped, twisted a full 180 degrees away from an in-depth understanding as it originally meant, to become the monster of confirmation bias. The usage of the word reflection here has rendered said word useless in the same way that using the word light to describe dark would do so. Back in reality, away from the world of Dawah apologist and the realm of Islam, looking solely at the bastard text known as the Qur'an, we can read its scientific and ethical illiteracy without such demand for warping. The Qur'an has been proven wrong so many times that all the Dawah apologist is left with is the outright lie that it is perfect, that rivers and seas never mix, that the sun sets in a muddy spring on the earth, and that striking the dead with a beef steak can bring said person back to life. I, meanwhile, don't have to lie.
So the argument you're having outside of your MSA room with the philosophy club guy, that argument will go on forever. It started when I was there in the MSA. Back when I could barely grow beard here and I was discussing God with a guy across from the other room. And now it's another guy who's barely growing his beard here and he's arguing with another guy. And the arguments haven't actually changed. They haven't actually changed. The size of our cell phones have. But, it's cyclical. We're caught in this cycle. We have to understand there's something more.
Yeah. You don't have reality backing you up. That's why the arguments haven't changed, because Islam has failed to gain any ground whatsoever since the day of its foundation outside of war, brutality, and indoctrination. Oh, and I can't forget appeals to ignorance. The problem is not the non-believer. Science doesn't go, well, if you find something demonstrably wrong in what we say, then that is your problem. Only religion does that. Religion and other forms of con artistry, that is. You have only admitted that facts can be ignored if facts don't align with your assertions or the assertions of the Qur'an. The problem is that no facts align with the assertions of the Qur'an. It was an ignorant book written by ignorant people in ignorant times and has been greatly outdone repeatedly by other great works of fiction throughout history.
And that if we present the miraculous power of the Qur'an in a blanket way, the final issue with this is going to be it creates a problem. Like if I'm, for example, I'm a student of language. One of the things that fascinates me about the Qur'an more than anything else is the incredible language of the Qur'an. It's just mind-boggling how intricate the language of the Qur'an is. As a student of language, as a student of linguistics, and then a student of Qur'an, you are left just dumbfounded. You're just left dumbfounded. You know the ayat about shaitan? What directions he will attack from? And you would know, even if you don't know the Arabic, what directions will he attack from? From the front? From behind? From the right and the left. Okay? Now, the thing is, I gotta finish this talk because this is too interesting. Have a seat, everybody. So shaitan attacks from how many directions? The devil attacks from how many directions? 4. From in front, min bayni aydihim. Min bayni aydihim. From behind, min khalfihim. But then, an, not min. He changes the preposition. Now, in the English language, it says from in front, from behind, from the right, from the left. But the kind of from used when the right and the left are mentioned is changed. The kind of from used in the Arabic for the front and the back is the same, and the right and the left has been altered. It's an, it's not min, which again in translation would come across as from. You would notice a difference. Except an, the linguistically alludes to further distance. It alludes to more distance. Min is actually immediate, mubashir. It's immediate, direct. And an is more distant. On the right and the left there are angels of us. Yes? And he has to get through them. So there's a little bit more of a distance. Of the many explanations of da'an in the ayah, just down to the prepositions. Personally, I am fascinated by this stuff. I am mind blown by this stuff.
Meanwhile, a normal person with a basic understanding of language and writing will understand how stuff viewed to be important is written in a way to maximize its impact. This is nothing new. This is nothing impressive. This is nothing miraculous. It's commonplace. We see writers from all levels doing just what you described here. But the fact is, there are mistakes which have been addressed by people actually fluent in the language, including both secular and Islamic scholars, not to mention the plethora of internal contradictions which exist much like in the Bible. So again, another lie that will fail to impress anyone with the basic skills needed to check your assertions.
But I will not go out and say, here's the reason why the Qur'an is a miracle. I will say, here is what impacts me from the miracles of the Qur'an. Here's what makes the Qur'an beautiful to me, overwhelming to me. I'd like to share some of that with you. I'm not interested in a debate. And that's the last thing here. I know when Muslims think believers, atheists, then it's in your mind you see like a boxing ring. In a showdown. It's not a showdown. It's not a match. Debate is probably the worst kind of exercise you can do when it comes to this issue. Debating is kind of like a fight. Nobody goes into a match ready to lose. You don't go into a match ready to lose. You go into a match to take the other one out.
No. I go into discussion to test what I know and to check if it is in fact the most philosophically and scientifically sound position available. I spend my days looking for evidence to prove me wrong. I beg of it from apologists who, to this day, have never supplied it. You're right, discussion is the worst thing for you, as to get involved and to win, you need facts on your side, not raw assertions brewed from willful ignorance, which is all you actually have.
And if they tell you something that stumps you, meaning you prepared your arguments and the other came with arguments and it seems like they overwhelmed your arguments, it's not like you're going to say, oh, you win, I'm a believer now, or you win, I'm an atheist now. No. I'm going to go back to the drawing board and I'm going to come up with a way to punch you right back. In other words, the attitude in a debate is not one of accepting the other. It is one of crushing the other, right? So if you're already getting into a debate, that no, you're not heading down a productive road. You're just not heading down a productive road. We can have discussion, we can have an exchange of ideas, but you should have the common sense to know when it's turning into a debate and stop yourself, because it's just not productive. It doesn't bring any good. It doesn't have any good. May Allah Azza wa Jal help us understand this topic and its roots, and I pray that the youth among us that are kind of taken in sometimes by these kinds of arguments, it's not just our faith, by the way. Islam is the easy target nowadays as far as being criticized, but young people across faiths are actually losing faith. And that is not just that's their problem. I'm worried about the Muslim kids. Actually, that's a universal problem. Because Islam, if you look at the Qur'an, it actually called people that already had some kind of faith, which Islam considered in need of adjustment, in need of refinement. And then it purified it. Even the mushrik had a kind of faith, didn't he? He had some kind of faith. It just needed to be cleansed. It just needed tazkiyah. So even to have that premise to work with, that baseline to work with, that is where the invitation of Islam begins. So it is a problem across the board that people are losing faith, not just Muslims. And it is something that we have to try and address from its intellectual roots, from its social roots, from its psychological roots. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And the only way you are ever going to address that is if you start digging for some actual evidence to support your many unfounded assertions. I mean, I was waiting throughout this entire video for you to make something and actually back what you say. And I didn't get anything. All I got you was saying on record that ignore the evidence if it disagrees with you. Beyond that, I don't know what I can say. There are a few things which I'd just like to add here at the end of this video. The first is a massive thank you to everyone who has ever donated to me via Patreon. Your fantastic support has given me the ability to keep this channel going, and I hope to continue producing content in the years to come. Secondly, I would like to thank anyone who has ever interacted with this channel. Your shares, likes and dislikes, as well as your comments of both approval and disapproval, have ensured constant feedback, allowing me to improve my work. Last of all, I would like to express my desire that you treat any of the people displayed throughout the video with respect. Whilst it is true that ideas do not demand respect, and there are many in fact which deserve reprehension, we must be careful on how we tackle said ideas in ensuring we are not simply targeting the person. In short, be the compassionate side of reason. So take care, and I'll see you next time.